Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining AWSN today for this interesting webinar. We are joined by our speaker, Tamara Martin. Welcome, Tamara, and welcome to everyone who joined us today. We will begin the webinar, and before that, I'd like to remind a few housekeeping rules. Note that this session is live. Please post your questions in the chat box. At the end of the session, we will answer the questions, so please keep sending the questions as the session progresses. The webinar will be for 40 minutes, leaving around 15 minutes for questions and answers. Today's topic, the role of physical security in COVID-19 landscape. Physical security involves security in depth, which is the use of multi-layers of interdependent systems such as the physical barriers, intrusion detection systems, CCTV, surveillance, security guards, access controls, locks and fences, etc., etc. All these techniques are designed to detect, deter, delay, or deny unauthorized access to facilities, equipment, resources, information, and data of an organization. Although the need for physical security may seem obvious, it can all too easily be overlooked. It makes no sense to have a layered approach to network or infrastructure security and neglect the physical aspect. Physical security should serve the same purpose. So in summary, physical security is a key component of the layered security implementation. I will now pass on to Tamara, who will introduce herself and talk further on the role of physical security in COVID-19 landscape.
Thanks so much, Reshma, and welcome all. Thank you so much for joining today. And I'd also like to just thank Reshma and more broadly AWSN for extending an invite to allow me to speak on this topic. It's quite exciting because my understanding is that in the past there haven't been a lot of physical security or resilience speakers, and we were going to do an event originally planned to be done this month, and then obviously with the events that occurred we shifted it to a webinar, which thanks to the technology that we have at our disposal meant that we could still go ahead with it, which is fantastic. So I'm really pleased. Just to give you a bit of who I am and what I do and where I've come from in terms of my career path. I actually started off as a lawyer. That's how I started my career. I'm reformed and recovered now. Hangovers from my previous career. And then decided that the law was really not what I wanted to do or to continue with. And so I moved my first role that was within the domain of security and resilience and anything that sort of falls under that auspice was with a consulting firm, which serviced a broad range of global and domestic critical infrastructure organisations. So that was in emergency crisis and physical security management. And then I moved into my first client-side role with Jemena, which is a predominantly utilities energy company, and then moved into a role that became available with AGL Energy, which is where I'm currently employed, and my role is a security resilience manager. And since joining AGL in, it's coming up to 3 years, which has gone very, very quickly, but I have enhanced all my skills and expertise in a wide range of areas, but predominantly business resilience, and specifically the intelligence-led aspects, strategic physical security, crisis management, travel security, and then working with my colleagues to work across parts of cybersecurity as well, which will be of particular interest, I suspect, for some of you who are listening to this webinar today. just a little bit about AGL, just to give some context. I think it will assist particularly with this presentation so that you can understand what my role has been responsible for in managing the response to COVID-19, but also more broadly what my colleagues in other organisations have most likely been undertaking. So AGL, for those of you who don't know, AGL Energy is one of the biggest gen tailors in Australia, which means that it generates and is a retailer of electricity and gas, and operates across Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland and Western Australia. It's Australia's largest ASX listed investor in renewable energy and is deemed an essential service provider, which has been particularly pertinent in this current environment. Relatively recently, it's acquired both Perth Energy and Southern Phones in a move to converge both data and telecommunications, and has three main strategic priorities, which is growth, transformation and social licence. So just to give you an idea of my role within AGL, I'm not confined to just the corporate space. My role also operates across the operational assets as well. That's my remit, looks across that, and that's assets which are traditional coal and gas-fired generation, but also those renewable assets which are wind, hydro and solar. So it's an extensive and very interesting remit. To talk about just the role that I have or that my colleagues have within the security and resilience space, and I promise I'll get into the crux of what this webinar is focused on. But I wanted to take some time to give you some context, just because my understanding is that some of you might not necessarily be so familiar with what a physical security or resilience specialist does within organisations. And so I just thought it was worth taking the time just to take you through some of the responsibilities that like roles have. And obviously the caveat there is that there are nuances to each of these roles within organisations, but broadly this will cover some of the elements. And so for example, part of my work is maintaining a threat and intelligence-led approach on issues such as protester and aggressive customer management. So the intelligence-led aspect ties in closely to open source intelligence, which is hugely interesting and growing more and more in its relativity to the work that we undertake. Providing security advice and support to those major business development projects and events that occur within the organisation, such as annual general meetings, and ensuring that there are the correct security mechanisms and organisation around those. But also large projects as well, so inputting advice and specifications for that. And then one of the big aspects is managing and advising not only on the business domestic travel portfolio, but internationally as well. And that became very relevant, particularly when COVID-19, when that incident kicked off at the start of the year. And aspects of that are done in collaboration with cybersecurity, so things like managing secure device access and working collaboratively on that. Coordination and exercising of the crisis arrangements, as well as crisis and emergency business disruptions, which has been occupying me, and I say that with relish. I've been very much enjoying it. It's been a challenge. There has certainly been I think a lot of you would probably agree that there was, we're sort of blazing a trail somewhat with the events that have been occurring. And then some examples of strategic projects that I've worked on, and one which I'm really enjoying at the moment is standardisation and integration of the organisation's security access control, CCTV and induction systems, and designing, implementing mass communication and alert system for emergency and crisis management and security incidents. Designing and delivering a process for the standardisation of security contracting nationally. And something really cool that we did last year was trialling automated artificial intelligence robot technology. So that was to bolster the capability that we already had with our physical security officers, but we trialled some robot technology through a little robot called Bimbo at one of our corporate workplaces to perform autonomous patrols, detect movement, and it was a really interesting trial, and it was really it was welcomed by the business, and I suspect that we'll be seeing the use of technology like that more and more in the future. So I'll move now to main points that I wanted to speak to today, and obviously focusing on the... First of all, I'd just like to preface it by saying that I hope all of you are doing well in these challenging times. They're uncertain times, but I would also suggest that there is some great opportunities to be had, which I'll sort of take you through over the course of this presentation. I don't think it's all negative. There is, I certainly sympathise for a lot of people who are out there and struggling. But I hope that there is opportunities to be gained. And so I'm speaking from my experience with this and how my role within the organisation supported the management of this particular incident and as it escalated. So I think right at the beginning, one of the key aspects that we needed to be across and have surety over was our international and domestic travel program. So when things really started to escalate with COVID-19, we had travellers overseas, and then obviously domestically we have a because of the geographic spread of our assets, there any given week we have quite a large number of our employees who are travelling nationally. And so if I start with the international context, it was moving so rapidly that we and we leveraged off. We have a great partnership with International SOS, which is our travel security and health provider, and they provide us with a great system where we have oversight of our travellers and where they are at any given time. And so we were looking at where they were placed internationally, whether that particular country had, as you might already be aware, countries were enacting restrictions at varying levels and at varying speeds as well. So we had to be across the countries that they were in, whether or not they could continue with their travel or whether the advice was that they should return home. And as soon as the advice was released by the federal government that Australia's borders were closing, that became incredibly critical to ensure that we were able to repatriate our people back into the country. And some of that was required government support as well. And it wasn't just looking at our people who were on business associated travel, but it was working with our HR business partners to understand, well, as you know, we all take holidays, and there were quite a few of our people who were stuck in countries who were on leisure leave, and so it was being able to extend our support to them and give advice to them and help them to come home as well as quickly as possible. Domestically, because of the nature of AGL's operations and it being deemed an essential service, we were given a bit of a hall pass by the federal government, albeit working within very tight restrictions, so that travel could continue for those employees who perform critical functions, particularly across our operational sites. So it was really important to be able to continue that. But then domestically, again, it was moving everything, the restrictions were being enacted very quickly. They were being enacted sort of, it wasn't necessarily a federal approach, it was state by state, so we had to be quite careful in understanding, you know, how to bring people back, or whether or not we could advise them that they could stay within that state or territory for a little bit longer, or and that sort of thing. So that was quite interesting. On the mass communication capability, we, as I said, when I first started at AGL, one of my first major projects was implementing an alert and notification system, which enabled us to send essentially SMS and emails to our workforce. We did start off with that tool being only available at a corporate level. So it was implemented for security and emergency incidents at a corporate level, and we've utilised it in the past for evacuations, shelter-in-place incidents, as well as those police incidents like the Burke Street and Flinders Street incidents. There was a request by the sort of executive levels within the organisation, given that things were moving so rapidly with our response and management of COVID-19, that we extended that to be able to cover our operational sites. And so we had to move very quickly, and this is what I'm talking about. So those opportunities that present themselves is that I'd actually wanted to extend that capability to our operational sites so that we could create distribution lists for all of our sites nationally. But it's sort of one of those things that gets put into a BAU bucket, and then all of a sudden the utility is seen as if you can communicate to your workforce, particularly if you need to activate plans very, very quickly, you suddenly get the resources. So it's fantastic because with the help of IT and HR, what we were able to do was within less than a week in the back end reconfigure the system so that we then had the capability to send those alerts and notifications, if need be, to the entirety of our workforce. So for me, that was really, it gave me comfort to know that we had that capability. Access control measures. So as Reshma alluded to in her fantastic introduction into physical security, is that yes, it is, a lot of it is about access control. So those swipe access cards that you were using before you all moved to working from home, and when you enter into a building, you'll often see that there's CCTV as well, and then there's this sort of physical presence of security officers who will be who do a great job in securing our facilities as well. What it meant was, if I speak to it at a corporate level, when the decision, AGL, by the way, because of it being classified as an essential service, we were never told that it was never a mandate that we had to move all of our people out of the workplace. It was a decision made by the executive team in the interests of the health and safety of our people. that they would move to a working from home arrangement. And that happened in just a matter of days, if not 24 hours. The decision was made, and I work within the broader property services team. And so my colleagues and I had to pivot very, very quickly to put in place arrangements to, once employees knew that they could no longer, that they were no longer going to be accessing the workplace, ensuring that the building was secure. Because obviously one of the risks that then arises is with no people in your building, you need to be able to secure it. And also to try and deter people, and most of it was a misunderstanding if they hadn't been communicated to that they were no longer able to come into the workplace, things like locking down access. So for us, it was looking at redacting or suspending access for all of our employees to our corporate workplaces, and then having much better and having oversight of access data. So, for example, looking almost daily at who was still accessing, because there were still critical functions that needed to be able to access our workplace. So just having oversight to ensure that they were the people that were entering into our buildings and facilities just to ensure their safety. But then also working in close cooperation with the business to identify those critical functions that would still need to work out of the building. And so, for example, there were a lot of our IT department that there was a small cohort that needed to remain within the workplace to be able to ship out equipment and technology to employees. And then it felt like, in terms of access control, it felt like we went from moving people out one week and then we were already looking to recovery. So as restrictions have been eased, we've been looking to move back those critical functions and those people back into our workplace where it just simply wasn't tenable for them to continue to work from home. A really good example of that is that AGL has a very large workforce of customer service representatives, so call centre representatives. So it wasn't just all offshore. We have a large call centre demographic in both South Australia and Victoria. And as you can appreciate, if their job requires them to be on the phone, working from home when you've got that background noise or the setup just wasn't allowing them to be able to complete their role comfortably, it was important to be able to identify them as critical workers. And so we then moved to recovery in that we wanted to move those people back into the buildings, but with it arose those challenges of social distancing and then reinstating their access and looking at the periods of time that they would need to be working within the building. Something that I would say about how we've been managing this is that we've been scaling up in a very considered way, in a manner which has been carefully planned, because working with safety and health and HR, just understanding just the logistical difficulties of now transitioning people back into a workplace, in that in a building where you usually have hundreds of people occupying it, is that you can only have, say, 2 people per lift. So it was looking at those sorts of things, and then blocking and then changing the way that we bring people into the workplace, so that we now have one point of entry and one point of exit, which brings me neatly to the next point in how we supported the management of COVID-19, which was screening processes. Again, it wasn't something that it was mandated, but it was certainly seen as best practice. And if we compared it and contrasted it to countries who had opened up before us, it provided us with a good roadmap to follow in opening up our workplaces again. And in fact, it was something that I should note that our operational sites never closed. That's why your electricity is still running and your lights are still on, because of being an essential service. AGL needed to continue its business operations 24/7. And so to do that and to ensure the safety and health of its employees, it implemented screening processes. So we were able to look at not only what they'd done at our operational sites in terms of that, to look at best practice, but also what countries had been implementing and doing it that way. So we weren't flying completely blind, but it was something that we took very, very seriously, and we looked at how best to do that. And so we've actually leveraged off our physical security guarding workforce, and they do a terrific job of undertaking those screening processes. So first and foremost, when people come into a building, they're now funneled to a point where at the moment it's manual screening processes. So that is a digital thermometer, which a reading is taken by our security officer to ensure that they haven't got an elevated temperature, and they also are read a series of questions to help determine whether or not they're fit to come into the workplace from a health sense. Some technology, because I would suggest that with the way that coronavirus is tracking, I think it's something that is the challenges of social distancing. Certainly you can infer that it will be with us for quite some time, certainly until a vaccine is found. And as you can appreciate, as we move more and more people to our capability back into the workplace, something that needs to be considered is how can we do it efficiently and yet still be doing it so that it satisfies the requirements, and that we're doing it to the right levels. And so technology that we've procured is thermal screening cameras. And again, I've been liaising with my colleagues to understand what is the best placement for these. Will we still need to have, as a redundancy or as a backup measure, will we still need to undertake those manual screens by security officers? And if I give an example, the answer in short is yes, because although certainly using those screening cameras, those thermal cameras, will create efficiency so that we don't end up with bottlenecks where people are lined up outside our buildings. If, for example, someone returns a positive reading, you then need to lean on your physical security workforce to be able to undertake secondary checks. And so it isn't all just automated, but certainly leaning on those on that technology will help us in the future. In terms of in pre-COVID times, because of AGL's operations, it has attracted the attention of particularly environmental activists. And so previously it was about physical activism, but something that we had to be cognizant of, and this is where I've worked with my cybersecurity colleagues, is that the environmental activists still wanted to be heard. And so for them, there was a switch to digital activism. And so it was still looking across open source intelligence to understand, well, if your focus is no longer undertaking physical activism because of social distancing restrictions, then are we a target from an online hacktivism point of view. Thankfully, so far, it doesn't seem we haven't been a focus, but it was certainly something to be aware of. And I think that's a point just overall to highlight with this COVID-19 incident, is that the world and organisations have been so focused on the management and response to COVID-19 that it's incredibly important not to forget that the threats and the risks which were still which were present pre-COVID haven't necessarily faded away and shouldn't be forgotten. So it's not only just managing COVID-19 per se, but it's also having an awareness of, well, what risks do we also need to stay across, which have never left, and potentially have actually arisen out of COVID-19. So, and then duty of care, and this was a really interesting one, because previously AGL has always been a flexible workplace, and so working from home was always an option for employees. But then moving an entire corporate workforce, and potentially, depending on how things escalated, how things unfolded at site, was how far does your duty of care extend? So looking at how we could offer security assistance for our operational sites and our working from home arrangements. And one of the things that we did was we leveraged off the security contracts, or the physical security contracts that we had in place nationally, and put in place a mechanism whereby if an employee was at site and unable to leave, but their family was at home, that if their family felt unsafe, then we could organise a routine patrol to go and support their families. And so those sorts of just thinking more broadly, and thinking about how can we best look after our people and their families in these challenging times, so extending that out. And so I think that covers sort of how my role has been supporting the organisation in managing COVID. It's ongoing. It's and certainly it's a very fluid situation. And yes, there have been challenges, but it has been, I've sort of relished being able to tackle those challenges with other teams within the organisation, and also talking to people outside of AGL, and just getting an understanding of, well, how have you been working to tackle certain issues and that sort of thing. So that would be, I suppose, the main part of my presentation, and I'm very happy to move on to questions if there are any.
Thank you. That was really great explanation, Tamara, and especially knowing around the essential services during this COVID-19 and what actually happens in the background, and how these critical parts of the business is so key in running our business, given COVID-19 or any other crisis, I suppose. So the questions, I'll start with the question here. What factors assisted your organization to manage COVID-19 incidents?
Yeah, so I'm just going to stop my share for just a moment, because I do have some notes, because I think that this is, it's a really great question, and something that I suspected might crop up. And so in terms of that, that response, what was hypercritical was it being a coordinated response, and being led from the top down. So what I mean by that is that executive oversight, and then that coming down and down the layers of the organisation. Communications was absolutely and continues to be key. Tracked actions, being able to scale up and down the response depending on what was occurring. Regular touchpoint briefings, so meeting regularly, and the reliance on structured frameworks and processes. So what I mean by that is got business continuity plans, crisis management plans, and even the development of action plans to match what was happening. And then not forgetting to look to recovery even during the peak response period. So that was really important. And then and also having governance through strategic planning, but then leaning on arms within the business, so particular teams and groups to implement those actions.
Thank you for that, Tamara. We'll go on to the next question. Given the effects of COVID-19, how do you see security or resilience potentially changing within organizations?
Yeah, good question. I would suggest, or certainly I would hope, that there is a greater appreciation and focus on resilience programs within organisations. I think depending on the business that you're in, sometimes crisis management, business continuity planning, emergency management planning, everything that falls under that umbrella is sort of seen as, yeah, well, we've got it, but we're only going to use it when we need it. And so it's sort of, if I use the analogy, it's sort of dusted off only when it's really required. So I think given that the protracted nature of COVID-19 and how long it's been going on for, I think that there'll be a greater awareness of how important it is to have really robust planning, preparedness, training, testing, and ensuring that the organisation is ready to face unprecedented events. I would also suggest that there might also be more global, holistic approach to issues. So if I think about previously, it might be that organisations responded to things in silos, whereas for an enhanced response or for a response that does its best is when you work well together. So for example, I'm working very closely with not just the property team that I sit within BAU, but also risk teams, cybersecurity teams, safety teams, and health teams as well. I think that risk reviews will be revised and revisited to sort of look at those risks and how they've changed and flexed, and what organisations will be facing in the future. Potentially it will be that, particularly if I'm looking at physical security, it will become sort of centre-led. If you look at the challenges being faced by needing to, with social distancing, is that you still need to be able to protect all of your assets and stay across them. So and have real-time tracking of them. So what that could mean is, say, centralised operations centres, so that you have that security and resilience and emergency management layers that is centrally managed but across all of your operations. I could probably go on for quite some time on this, but I want to allow for other questions. I think also in terms of travel, that will be a big component that will change. Travellers may be a little bit nervous to travel internationally and even domestically in the future, just given the changes and what it will mean for them when they're travelling. But not just that, but even when they're travelling to other countries, what it could mean, how the dynamics might have changed, and also understanding that depending on restrictions, how they might change very quickly as well. So I think there will be a heightened sense of rethinking the way that things are approached in the future.
Definitely. And you just mentioned the security aspect of it and everybody thinking differently in COVID-19. The next question is, are there any security which may be amplified because of COVID-19?
So if I focus on something that I've been thinking about myself, is that, and it's something that, that ASIO released a paper on as well. It's the insider threat and the implications of that. So, and that could be intentional or unintentional, but certainly, unfortunately, because of the socio-economic impacts that people will have faced due to COVID, and then a lot of them working remotely, the ability to have oversight and protecting against risks associated with that, I think that will certainly change.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is, Robert's planning to recover from COVID-19 on our long, slow release of restrictions. Lots of BCM like me, which is Chris Miller's question here. BCM like me and you and Tamara are busy working through these details, some of which you've explained a moment ago. Sorry, but now I'm reading it back. That was Chris's comment.
Okay.
Sorry. The next one is, can you expand on how do you think AI will assist physical and cybersecurity in the future? What did you find were the best and worst aspects of AI you used?
Okay, that's a good question. And so if I talk about the technology that we trialled, so in terms of robotics, I think that could certainly become more relevant in the future because of social distancing restrictions. Being able to potentially looking to secure workplaces and sites, and being able to do that through those sort of robotic technologies would be incredibly helpful. I think there will, that's not to detract from the fact that physical resourcing will still always be required, but I think that is certainly something that will be leveraged more and more in the future. And that's also working closely with cybersecurity, because then if you're integrating it with, say, your VMS systems, your CCTV systems and that sort of thing, then it's working closely with cybersecurity to make sure that all those security checks and balances have been checked off. The best and worst aspects of artificial intelligence, I'd have to say, in terms of the experience that we had when we trialled the robotics, it was all really, really positive. It was such a good bolster to what we already had, and having that live stream, or the capability to have real-time information that you could get remotely, and also from a health and safety respect, it's your reducing the risk of endangering your people by putting them in positions where it might be dangerous circumstances. So instead you're able to use that AI.
Thanks, Tamara. The next question is, did you have to make specific additions or modifications to security policies as applicable to COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, so yes is the short answer. We really had to think about how access control had previously worked within the organisation. And again, because things didn't alter operationally, so people were still, it was BAU at our operational sites, but certainly access control at a corporate level, because people were moved to working remotely, was all of a sudden revoking access, albeit temporarily, was being able to communicate that so that people understood why we had to change that policy and why only certain people would have their access reinstated. And I think I'd suggest that if there's good rationale behind what you're doing, which we certainly did, we were looking after the best interests of our people, and we wanted to ensure that only those, and also looking after our assets and best securing that. And so the rationale behind it meant that people understood why we needed to alter those policies and procedures. And moving forward, I suspected that they will need to adapt as well into the future.
Sure, thank you. That's the last of the questions we've got. Any more questions that are coming through? You can post it now. Otherwise, we could. Yeah, so that's the end of the questions, Tamara.
Perfect.
Yes. Thank you very much for the insights in the physical security world. And thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much.
No, absolute pleasure. And thank you so much to everyone for joining. And Reshma, you were a wonderful hostess. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Just moving on. Yes, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today and making this webinar quite interesting. I would like to just remind the next steps on it. So next webinar is on the 16th of June at 4 p.m. AWSN has a AGM on the 29th May at 11:30 a.m. There's also, please don't forget, expression of interest to join AWSN. Lastly, leadership program. We would like to thank everyone that applied for the Cyber Leadership Institute. The results will be out soon. And if I don't have any more questions, that brings us to the end of this session. Once again, thank you very much, Tamara, for joining us, joining AWSN, and for your time today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining AWSN's webinar today. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next webinar. Thank you very much.